Thank you for joining us for tonight's program on foreign policy, featuring General H.R. McMaster and Jamie Metzel. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. We're now in our 49th year of providing the Vail community with thought-provoking and affordable programming. 2 items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. You can type your questions in there at any time, and we'll get to as many audience questions as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and that recording will be posted to vailsymposium.org. I'd like to thank some of the organizations and individuals that helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. The winter season is underwritten by Jeannie and Dale Mosier. The geopolitical series is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Funding has been provided to the Vail Symposium by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the CARES Act. If you're a Vail Symposium donor, thank you. If you're not a donor but would like to ensure the Vail Symposium is able to continue to offer quality programming, please visit vailsymposium.org to donate. I hope you'll make plans to join us on Tuesday, December 15th at 6 p.m., when an expert panel of defense researchers and military professionals address the national security impacts of climate change. Tonight, we turn our attention to foreign policy. Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford University. A native of Philadelphia, General McMaster graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1984. He served as an Army officer for 34 years and retired as a lieutenant general in 2018. He remained on active duty while serving as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. He taught history at West Point and holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our moderator tonight is Jamie Metzel, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, novelist, blogger, syndicated columnist, media commentator, and expert in Asian affairs and biotechnology policy. He has served in the U.S. National Security Council, State Department, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as Executive Vice President of the Asia Society, and with the United Nations in Cambodia. One last comment before I hand things over to Jamie, just a reminder to please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to type your questions for tonight's speaker. Jamie, I'm handing it over to you.
Here we go. Future generations are going to watch these videos and remember this moment where we would all go on Zoom and everyone would be yelling, "Unmute yourself." So anyway, thank you so much, Claire and Chris, and thank you to all of my friends in the Vail Symposium community. For me, I do a lot of these kinds of events, but it's sad and painful that I've done so many with all of you in Vail and to do it virtually. But if we are going to do it virtually, what a great way to do it, and what a great guest we have today. And General McMaster is really a hero, a great patriot who's dedicated his life to making our country a better and stronger place. And we're all better for it. And he's gone through many, many travails, many difficult environments and situations, from Afghanistan and Iraq to a little bit in the White House. And we're going to discover and explore all of that in our conversation. So General McMaster, welcome.
Hey, Jamie, what a privilege it is to be with you. Thanks for the honor of having a conversation with you. And I can't thank Claire and Chris enough for the kind invitation.
So I'll start with the ultimate hardball question. Why'd you write the book?
Well, you know, maybe predictably for somebody who served in the Army for 34 years, my plan was to serve for 5 years after West Point. So my wife, Katie, often says, thanks for the bonus 29. But I made a mission statement for myself, kind of predictably. And what I wanted to do was in my second career, contribute to a better understanding, a deeper understanding of the challenges we face so that we can help build a better future for generations to come. I had hoped that writing this book would be a continuation of my own self-education, but then also to be able to share my perspective on the challenges that we're facing, the opportunities we face internationally. And also, I hope that the book would help bring Americans back together. You know, I think that it's quite obvious how polarized we are as a society these days. And I think we ought to be able to come together around issues of foreign policy and national security.
Yeah, I completely agree. We used to have this saying that at the water's edge, we're all Americans working together, and bringing that back would just help us all on so many levels. In the book, you write about how the world, or some piece of the world, wanted you to write a book kind of like John Bolton's book, a policy book, but also a tell-all. But you decided to write more of a strategy book. Tell me about that decision.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, do we really need another tell-all from the Donald Trump administration? I don't think that would have been useful. I wanted the book to last a while, you know, and to be a book that people can go to understand the challenges that we face really on their own terms, and to be able to view those challenges through the lens of our vital interests, and then to think clearly about what goals we should try to achieve and how we should go about trying to achieve those goals, again, with an eye toward building a better future. You know, I'm a historian, Jamie, so, you know, kind of predictable that I think that the approach to understanding the problems of today, it really has to begin with understanding how the recent past produced the present. And it's only then you can make a projection into the future. So I wanted to tell the history of how these challenges developed and how we've interacted with them, especially across recent decades. And then finally, you know, Jamie, I think in the vitriolic partisan environment we're in these days, you can either try to transcend it or you can get drugged down into it. And I hope that people who supported Donald Trump would read it, and people who hated Donald Trump would read it, and then maybe find common ground. And I'll just say as well, you know, the position of national security advisor is unique in the foreign policy establishment. You know this well because you served there, in that the national security advisor is the only person in the foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And it has to be a position of trust, or else the president won't get access to best analysis across the departments and agencies, as well as options presented to the president to make decisions. And I think to violate that trust in kind of a tell-all way, in a way that could be used against still a sitting president, I think would damage that relationship between a national security advisor and a president in the future. And I didn't think it was necessary to do that. You know, Jamie, in the book, I'm very critical of Trump policies and statements and you know, behavior at times. But I just didn't. I decided not to do it in an ad hominem way, or in a way that would violate the trust of the office that I was in, and an office I was in as an active duty officer as well. And I think it's important for us who are retired, the washed up generals and admirals, to do our best to keep that bold line between partisan politics and our military profession.
Yeah, well, I certainly respect that. I mean, I come from, I'm not traditionally Republican, as many people know, but I certainly encouraged any of my friends who asked for, certainly in the foreign policy world, some of whom worked with you in the White House, that they should go, that whatever anyone's view on politics, we're all Americans. And even if you disagree with certain aspects of policy, if you're inside, you certainly are better able to steer things. So let's go back a little bit to when you got the call. I don't think you were fully anticipating that you were going to be invited to become national security advisor. What went through your mind? How did you go about making that decision?
Well, I was walking down Walnut Street in my hometown of Philadelphia when my phone rang. I was on my way to the Foreign Policy Research Institute to give a briefing on a study that I commissioned about 18 months earlier on Russian new generation warfare, and to receive feedback from scholars and those who study Russia's sustained campaign of subversion against Europe, the West, and as well as their application of disruptive technologies and new military capabilities. And my phone, it was a partially blocked Washington number. It was the deputy chief of staff saying, "Hey, can you come to Mar-a-Lago to interview for the job of national security advisor?" So of course I said yes. I mean, I was an active duty officer in my 33rd year of service. I had planned to retire from the Army later that year. I viewed this as kind of a bonus round. I mean, President Trump was the was the fifth commander in chief I've served since I was sworn in as a cadet at West Point at age 17. And it was really an easy decision for me to help the elected president. I hope to succeed, right? For all the reasons that you mentioned. I know people will think it's kind of odd, but I never even voted. And the reason I didn't vote is because I took the example of George Marshall, who took that extreme measure of not voting to keep his service in the military separate from partisan politics. And I encourage everyone to vote. I voted for the first time now in this presidential election because I am retired. And I think other officers should vote if they want. I don't think that I would want to try to force that on people. But I'd been really an apolitical person, and so I went to Mar-a-Lago, got there Sunday. This is President's Day weekend. I interviewed with the president. I was asked to stay for a second interview on Monday. On my way into the interview, I awkwardly ran into Ambassador Bolton in the men's room. They were trying to keep us separate, apparently. And then the president offered me the job. He made the announcement. We flew back on Air Force One. This is now Monday evening. And they had aircraft waiting for me to fly me back to my house in Tidewater, Virginia, where I packed a bag. And I walked into the West Wing of the White House the next day, the next afternoon. So there wasn't really a whole lot of time for contemplation and preparation. But what I was grateful for, Jamie, more than maybe anything else, was the opportunity to have researched and studied and written about national security decision-making in my first book, In Dereliction of Duty, and to identify pitfalls in the decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam. And so as a historian, I was resolved to at least not repeat the same mistakes, maybe make some new ones. And I was able to, I think, set up a National Security Council decision-making process for the president that was effective, despite all the friction and associated with the new administration. Anyway, transitions are always hard. Yeah. But I think especially hard when you have such a disruptive and unconventional president and such a dramatic swing, I think, in policies between the previous administration and the Trump administration.
And you had never met President Trump before that first meeting, you say in the book. And I imagine, like everybody else, you had certain perceptions of the president, who sometimes, I think, I've never met him, but can be presented as being a bit caricaturish. What were your perceptions before you worked with him? And how were those perceptions different, if they were, over the course of getting to know him better?
Right. I've spent a lot of my time overseas, and I probably didn't understand American politics very, very well, right? I was pretty naive about it. But I did have a sense that Donald Trump had tapped into a sentiment in America, a sentiment among those who felt left behind, who were dissatisfied with previous policies, economic policies, as well as foreign policies and domestic policies that left large portions of the American population behind. It was a reaction in part, I think, to the consequences of unchecked globalization, the consequences that you can see, in places like Dayton, Ohio, areas that were left behind. So I had read, George Packer's book. I'm a big fan of his writing and his journalism, and he wrote a great book called The Unwinding, which is way before Donald Trump. But as you read it, you can see Donald Trump coming, like in every page, and he was elected to disrupt, the policy elites with whom many Americans were disenchanted, right? So I was also a bit disenchanted myself with foreign policy, James. I really think because I was on the receiving end of policies and strategies developed based on, I think, self-delusion and fantasy in Washington rather than reality on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I thought it was an opportunity. It would be an opportunity to help an unconventional president think about his agenda in foreign policy and make decisions to advance American interests and to build a better future. My experience in the 13 months, wasn't without significant friction. I think I got used up slowly in those 13 months. But I think in those 13 months, we got some very good and positive policy results, some of which have been reversed in the time since then, I think with very bad consequences, but others that have remained. And I think were clearly appropriate in that period. And I would say foremost among those positive shifts was the shift from an approach, something you know a lot about, an approach of cooperation and engagement with China under flawed assumptions or assumptions we cling to for too long, and a competitive approach to the policies of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. It's interesting that you mentioned George Packer, because George Packer's next book was about my mentor, Richard Holbrooke, and Dayton, Ohio, which you mentioned, was the place of Richard's greatest achievement. And yet, over time, it was kind of a tragedy for such a great person. There was a mismatch between the kind of George Marshall role of America as the guarantor of the world and what was possible given the changes in the world and the changes here at home. In the book, you write about strategic hubris or strategic narcissism, which it seems to me reflects that mismatch, that we kind of have this national feeling like it's 1945 all over again. But we're in a different world. Tell us a little more about what you mean by strategic narcissism.
Well, strategic narcissism is this tendency, especially since the end of the Cold War, to define the world mainly in relation to us, and then to assume that what we do or decide not to do will be decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And of course, Jamie, the problem with that is it's self-referential, and it ignores the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have, especially our adversaries, our rivals, and our enemies. And I think that strategic narcissism really became a major problem after the end of the Cold War. It was a period of confidence, right? We had reason to be confident. We had won the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed, and then soon after the collapse, or as the Soviet Union was collapsing, we had a lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world in Operation Desert Storm. And I think we bought in to three overlapping assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world. First among these was that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. A related assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past, and that our technological military prowess, as demonstrated during Desert Storm, would guarantee our security into the foreseeable future. If any foe had the temerity to challenge the United States, that war would be waged quickly, cheaply, and efficiently, and mainly from standoff range. This is the so-called kind of orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs. And I think all of this was a setup. It was a setup for the difficulties and the frustrations and the disappointments that we encountered in the 2000s. And of course, foremost among these was the most destructive terrorist attack in history on September 11, 2001, when terrorists used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our technological military prowess and capabilities. And then there was the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we often want to debate, should we have done it? Meaning, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think we ought to debate more often, who the heck thought it would be easy? And why did they think it would be easy? And I write about it in Battlegrounds about how the short-term approach to long-term problems really made those wars much more costly and longer. And then, of course, the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And I think it was at that moment when the Obama administration came in and was already determined to define its foreign policy mainly as in opposition to the George W. Bush administration, that the pendulum swung from overconfidence and a touch of hubris and a tendency to undervalue the risk and cost of action to one of pessimism and resignation, and a tendency to undervalue the risks and costs of inaction or disengagement. So whereas I think 2003 invasion of Iraq is an example of the former, the complete disengagement from Iraq in December 2011, as well as the unenforced red line in Syria, are examples of the latter. And so the argument in the book is really for sensible and sustained engagement from a foreign policy and national security perspective.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And I remember I was working for then Senator Biden in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and I remember him coming back from the George W. Bush White House in the early days and saying the decision's already been made, they're invading Iraq. And I remember just from our small group of staff members, it was like, what's that got to do with anything? And there was all of this thing, we have this ability, let's just use it. And certainly in the early days of the Obama administration, as somebody who keeps a close eye on China and has studied it for many years, when there was this message coming out of the White House that all we need to do is project respect and not mention human rights, and somehow magically we're going to get some kind of behavior change. I remember thinking, well, geez, that doesn't sound right either. And getting this balance is really tough. And yet you served in the Trump administration, where it feels, at least to me as a committed internationalist, that doesn't mean we can do everything, but I definitely believe, as I imagine you do, that the United States has a special and unique role and responsibility in the world, and an ecosystem has developed around us and around the way that we have shaped the world for many, many decades. And the Trump administration, as you write about in the book and said earlier just now, it had a profound isolationist tendency. So I'd love for you to, a little bit briefly, let's talk about a few different issues about what you think what we should have done and what we did, and what were the consequences in your mind of the gap between those two. And I think it probably makes sense to start with China, because in many respects, President Trump has, in some ways at least, been tough on China, but we are really in a rough place. What should it have been? And what's the gap between what you would have wanted us to do and what we ended up doing?
Well, I feel really good about where we are in terms of the U.S. approach to China, and I'll tell you, Jamie, when I convened the Principals Committee of the National Security Council to frame an approach to China in advance of the president's meeting with Xi Jinping in April of 2017, I read some passages from previous administration policies, including the Obama administration policy, and I just made the observation that we're about to effect the largest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and a shift that I think was long overdue. And that's because I think our previous approach to China was based fundamentally, at least in the post-Cold War period, on the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, and then as it prospered, it would liberalize its economy and then liberalize its form of governance. And I think it should have been apparent, at least from the time of Hu Jintao, certainly by the time of Xi Jinping, that quite the opposite was the case. And so what we try to apply to the framing of the situation with China is what we did across all these other challenges, and what I reflect in the book in terms of my overall approach to thinking about these challenges is a dose of strategic empathy to combat that strategic narcissism, and in particular to pay attention to the emotions and the aspirations and the ideology that drive and constrain the other, and in this case, the Chinese Communist Party leadership and Xi Jinping. And so as we crafted the approach to China, we concluded that China is driven by a combination of fear and aspiration. Fear of losing control. This is why they're obsessed with control. This is why you see the party extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power externally. This is why you see really the party perfecting this technologically enabled Orwellian police state, as well as putting 1.5 million people in concentration camps and extending the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong, and building the Great Firewall higher and higher, and tossing people in jail for decades, long sentences for having the temerity to criticize Xi Jinping. And so I think that it's clear that the party is fearful of losing its exclusive grip on power, but it also that's connected to a very aggressive foreign policy to meet the expectations of the population in connection with restoring pride and overcoming the century of humiliation, but really taking center stage in the world and establishing what Xi Jinping and other Communist Party leaders think is its rightful place, but to do so in a way that is at our expense and the expense of countries in the region. And this is really the effort to employ this strategy of co-option, coercion, and concealment that I describe in the book, and to create servile relationships across the Indo-Pacific region, to exclude the United States and then to challenge the United States globally. And what's remarkable is that this competition that's underway between the party's promotion of its authoritarian mercantilist model at our expense and the expense of countries around the world. We were absent from that competition for way too long, Jamie, because we clung to that assumption. So I think that there are three misunderstandings we'll go through just quickly on China that are worth correcting. This is very Chinese, right? The three misunderstandings of the competition with China. The first of these is that this is a competition really between the U.S. and China. Well, I mean, let's examine just the record since COVID-19, right? The Chinese Communist Party foists the virus on the world, right? by suppressing news of human-to-human transmission, by punishing the doctors who are trying to ring the alarm bells, and then adds insult to injury with this wolf warrior diplomacy, right? To obscure its responsibility, but then also to denigrate our response and denigrate our systems and portray theirs as superior. Well, how about now the aggressive acts that they've taken with the national security law, the extension of the repressive armament into Hong Kong. Xi Jinping's recent speeches where he said, "Hey, hostage taking, that's part of our approach to foreign policy. We're just going to do more of that." As we were raising concerns about the two Michaels who have been now taken hostage by China for almost 2 years, and then of course the attacks on the Himalayan frontier, the sinking, ramming and sinking of Malaysian and Vietnamese vessels in the South China Sea, the threats toward Taiwan, the massive cyber attacks on our medical research facilities in the midst of a pandemic, and then now look just at how the party is trying to pull out the stops to coerce Australia with a really radical form of economic warfare, as well as cyber attacks and disinformation. Okay, explain to me again, how is this a U.S.-China problem? No, this is a free world China problem. And so when people, our friends in the region say, "Oh, don't force us to choose," or in Europe, "Don't force us to choose between Washington and Beijing," I think we have to say, okay, that's not the choice you're facing. You're facing a choice between sovereignty and servitude. And so I think that's the first misunderstanding. I'll be shorter with the second and the third here. The second is, hey, the U.S. has gone it alone, right? America first, and of course, I mean, we could all do, right, without President Trump's gratuitous insults, mainly directed at our European allies, right? Okay, that's a given. That's counterproductive. So are steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies to get to China. I never figured that one out. But in the round, there's been a great deal of international cooperation, a growing amount of international cooperation. I think the relationship with Japan in this area is stronger than ever. The Quad format, India, Australia, the US, and Japan working together. Lots of multinational efforts on cybersecurity, indictments associated with Advanced Persistent Threat 10, APT-10, the main hacking arm for industrial espionage for the Chinese Communist Party. I could go on about that, right? More countries banning Huawei. The Europeans, taking the bold move of calling China a systemic competitor, right? So I think it's working. There's a backlash happening. There's going to be more multinational cooperation under Biden administration, but it's been there. It's been there. And then the third misunderstanding is that we face this false dilemma of either accommodating the party, appeasing the party, or a disastrous war. There's plenty of competitive ground. And what I think the policy is, and it's been implemented imperfectly like any policy, but it's pretty darn good. It's a policy of transparent competition, right? And I think about when President Trump, we were at the Great Hall of the People for the press conference at the end of the meetings on the first the full day of the state visit. And President Trump recounts some of our grievances associated with unfair trade and economic practices. But then after he recounts some of these, then he points to Xi Jinping and goes, "Hey, I don't blame you for this. I blame us for this because we didn't compete." I think that ought to be our attitude. Hey, don't blame us for re-entering arenas of competition that we vacated under flawed and overly hopeful assumptions.
Yeah, so I completely agree. As a matter of fact, I've been speaking at Vail Symposium for many, many years about we're underestimating the challenge from China. We need to be much, much tougher. In your number two, there's a lot of weight that you are using on the word "but" between here's the bad things that the Trump administration is doing, alienating our allies, undermining some of our closest relationships, undermining our perception of our faith in our own values, concepts of human rights, suggesting to Japan and South Korea that they should just go nuclear because they can't count on us. And then you have the word but, and then there are these other positive things. So let's talk about the things in your number two before the but, because when we look at a lot of these different issues, it's pretty damning. It's pretty undermining, even as we're being tough on China. I've always said, and I'm sure you'd agree, that the best way to be tough on China is to build an alliance of all of our allies and partners and friends and others who can effectively counterbalance China. That's why China was so afraid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are a lot of things that we could do that would really frighten China. Same with North Korea, that there's a lot that we can do together, and there's maybe been some progress. And yet the kind of erratic, at least at best, behavior of the Trump administration in having this, I know you weren't an enthusiast of these meetings with Kim Jong-un and giving up so much in exchange for nothing. If facing the China challenge is such an important thing, as I certainly believe it is, how can we reconcile what went before your but and what went after?
Well, what went before, I think, was, hey, maybe the mood music was better with allies. Maybe the atmosphere was better at cocktail parties, but we were getting our ass kicked, Jamie, right? Because we weren't competing effectively, right? So there's no prize for just membership in alliances, or as we know, right, in international organizations. These are competitive in and of themselves, and we have to focus our efforts on accomplishing objectives that are consistent with our mutual interests and our principles and values, as you're pointing out.
But are we getting our ass kicked less now, in your view, than we were
absolutely.
4 years ago?
Absolutely. I think 100% yes. And just if you just look at some of the examples of multinational cooperation, you have Japan, the United States, and others taking the lead now on infrastructure investment standards, for example, to counter the predatory lending practices and setting the debt trap that China has done for nations. I mentioned the Advanced Persistent Threat 10 action. I think it was 12 or 14 nations simultaneously announced indictments and sanctions against APT-10, doing that together. That was really an unprecedented law enforcement action and a multinational sanctioning action against APT-10. I think you see the UK now banning Huawei, Sweden, others will soon do that as well, based largely because of U.S. leadership. And hey, just asking the basic question, hey, do you think it's realistic that China's going to treat your citizens better than they treat their own people if you give them, your data? And so I really, I'm not down in the dumps about this. I would just say that when the Biden administration comes in, I think they should ramp it up, obviously, right? There are some key emerging competitions in the area of, for example, data standards, right? Internet privacy standards, that China is trying to gain an advantage that will favor, right, its authoritarian mercantilist model. And so the world's largest economies have to work together on that. I think that obviously we have major global issues, including essentially, obviously, climate change that we have to work on together. But we also have to recognize that there has to be a political dimension to this, because China is building 70 coal-fired plants a year as they speak the language of carbon neutral by 2060. But it's a lie, right? So I would just say, as the Biden administration comes in, 4 words of advice: do not fall for it. Wait, yeah. So maybe we're 5. Don't. and it would be the party's false promises of cooperation in exchange for not competing effectively, for alleviating sanctions, for not restricting sensitive exports and technologies to a company like Huawei or ZTE. So I think that the false promises will be in two areas: climate change, and then also on North Korea, which you mentioned. Yeah. And I think that really what's important on North Korea will be, don't fall for it by going back to the failed pattern of previous efforts to get North Korea to denuclearize, right? I think there's going to be a certain nostalgia, for multilateral negotiations with China, with North Korea. and a pressure to kind of accede to the North Koreans' approach toward extortion, right? Hey, pay me off just for the privilege of talking to me, and then that starts a long, drawn out, frustrating negotiation process that delivers a weak agreement that they then automatically break. I hope that the Biden administration will kind of strengthen this campaign of maximum pressure under the thesis, right? It's a thesis that Kim Jong Un can be convinced that he is safer without the weapons than he is with them. And there's much more to do to enforce UN Security Council sanctions that were really unprecedented, that were put in place in that first year of the Trump administration, largely due to the great efforts of Nikki Haley to get those through the UN Security Council. And those could include secondary sanctions on Chinese banks. I mean, I think that should be on the table. I think interdiction of ships that are circumventing the export restrictions and the import of fuel. So, hey, I think that it's mixed, obviously, as with any administration. I think you're right to point out that the emphasis should be on improved international cooperation on these issues to be more competitive. Because as you know, Jamie, right, China will take a divide and conquer approach, right? If we're not together. So, but I don't think it's as bad as it seems, right? And you saw the European Union letter, or the report on, hey, we need to really strengthen our strategic relationship with the United States. I think that's great, and I think that the Biden administration will be pushing on an open door in all these areas, and I'm excited about the possibilities.
Yeah, I'm certainly excited about the possibilities too, but I would just respectfully kind of see things with a different shade, in that it's my view that the United States is fundamentally weaker now in many ways than we were at least 4 years ago, which doesn't mean that I'm an apologist for anything that's happened before, because I think our allies that have looked at our example, they've looked at the instability of our political system, of leaders pitting one of us against the other, of undermining our alliances, of suggesting to our allies that they may or may not be able to count on us, even if they start to feel they have no other option. The glue, you mentioned George Marshall, the glue that kept the world together wasn't just hard power, as you know, it was all of these other things. It was that the United States stood for something. And certainly, in my view, when the president of the United States is forcefully articulating that we don't stand for that, it challenges some of those perceptions.
Well,
so,
Jamie, the book, Battlegrounds is largely an argument for a sustained approach to these problems that's sustainable and reasoned, and to stop kind of the vacillation that we've seen in recent administrations, especially those vacillations that are connected to defining a new administration's foreign policy, mainly as an opposition to the administration that went before. And I think this was the real pitfall of the Obama administration, right? Which everything was viewed through the lens of opposition to the 2003 Iraq War. And therefore, the belief that disengagement from complex problem sets abroad, especially in the Middle East, right? And it was an unmitigated good, right? The Middle East was, I think, the dominant view in the Obama administration was that it was mainly a mess to be avoided. Now, what's interesting is that the biggest flaws in the Trump administration foreign policy, from my perspective, are those areas where the Trump administration doubled down on the flaws of the Obama administration. It made it even worse in Afghanistan. I think is a great example of this.
So you don't think that the Trump administration was doing what you said the Obama administration was doing times 10 or 1,000, that will take positions in opposition of what Obama was doing? You think Obama administration did that more than Trump?
I'll tell you. I mean, of course, rhetorically, yes, right. Obviously, I mean, this is what that a lot of the president's rhetoric was right on in terms of that theme. But I think the areas where it was appropriate for the Trump administration to fundamentally change Obama administration's policies were with China, which occurred, were with Iran, which occurred, and I think should be sustained. I think it'd be a huge mistake to try to turn the clock back to 2016 and go back into the JCPOA. We can talk more about that. I think the president's strategy for South Asia, as announced in the speech in August of 2017, was right, but it was transitory, right? There were people in his ear, and he reversed that strategy, as he did the strategy towards Syria, to try to keep open at least some opportunity to exert influence on a political process to over time, right? Over time affect an end of the Syrian civil war in a way that didn't perpetuate the violence there or keep jihadist terrorists like ISIS on life support. So
Yeah.
I think these were all really good adjustments. Some of them were reversed, and those that were reversed essentially in the end wound up replicating the flaws of Obama administration policies. So
So
anyway,
yeah, but what? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what.
so
I mean, with
Jamie,
the
let me just say
withdrawal,
one other
yeah.
point. Let me say one other point here quickly. I think some of those flaws were related, right, to this retrenchment syndrome, right? This idea that our disengagement from complex problem sets abroad is an unmitigated good. But I'll tell you, this is not a partisan problem, Jamie, right? I mean, it's sometimes when you hear Rand Paul talk, it's like it's Ben Rhodes throwing his voice, right? I mean, this is not like it is not it is not a partisan issue. It's an issue where I think it reflects Americans being frustrated because they don't understand the two aspects of these commitments abroad that they need to understand. First
Yeah,
of all, what is at stake? And second, what is a strategy that will deliver an acceptable outcome at a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly it makes sense to talk about strategy. And yeah, when we talk about Syria, for example, I mean, I don't know who was helped by our betrayal of the Kurds, who'd been our honorable allies for many years. I don't know who was helped from pulling out of the climate change agreements. So many of these other things, and part of the power of the United States, as I was saying before, come from the credibility of the word of the president of the United States. So I certainly think.
Hey, Jamie, though,
Yeah.
here's what I'll tell you, though. That problem's not going to go away when Donald Trump goes away on January 20th.
No, I agree.
And,
I agree.
and I'll tell you the reason, the doubts, right? The doubts about, our ability to have a sustained approach to the Middle East, for example, are tied inexorably and primarily to the complete withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 in December. And I'm not saying this from a partisan perspective, right? I'm just saying this is just a fact, as well as the unenforced red line in Syria, 2013 to 14, after the Assad regime used chemical weapons for the mass murder of civilians. It had been a red line; it was unenforced. And then I think what's really interesting from a nonpartisan perspective to observe is that in Libya, right, the bombs no boots approach to Libya sought to avoid what the Obama administration saw as the egregious flaws in the Bush administration's approach to Iraq. But in seeking to do so, their perceived flaws, they exceeded them, right? They exceeded those flaws by doing nothing to shape really the political outcome in a war that, in large measure, because of this, is still raging, right? So I think what I do in the book, Jamie, is I don't say, hey, this is a Trump problem or an Obama problem. It's really an America problem. And in the region, when you talk to our friends in the region, oftentimes, and I would say, for example, to my counterparts from Saudi Arabia or UAE, and say, hey, how come you aren't imposing more costs on the Russians? The Russians are the main enablers of Iran across the region. That's your nemesis. That's your enemy. They're driving the cycle of sectarian violence. Why are you buying S-400 missiles, Saudi Arabia, from Russia? Why are you turning a blind eye to what they're doing in Syria? Why are you reestablishing diplomatic relations with the Assad regime? You know what they tell me, Jamie? Is, hey, we don't know if they're going to be around because we keep telling them we're going to disengage from the Middle East. Yeah. I mean, the phrase used in the Obama administration was our courageous withdrawal from the Middle East. So what they're engaged in is hedging. This is hedging behavior. Yeah. And therefore they buy in. They buy into Putin's lies and his Potemkin peace plans. Israel's even taken an approach of hedging vis-a-vis the Russians. Yeah, I agree with you, right? I agree that we need a sustained approach to these problems. And if foreign policy is partisan, that makes these swings worse, right? And makes us less reliable.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, that's the world that I come from, which is, I guess, why I feel so strongly about this. I mean, in those older days when I remember when Senator Biden and Senator Lugar were the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations, it didn't really matter who was chairman and who was ranking member because we had one foreign and national security policy. But what I would say, though, is to be a critic of the rapid withdrawal from Iraq, as I think both of us are. It forces us to say, well, to evaluate these other withdrawals critically, as I think we should, and whether it's from Syria, from climate change. But let me ask you this. Toward the end of the book, you say, the toxic environment in Washington, in the administration, and in the White House had hobbled my ability to make a positive contribution to the president and to the nation. And as you know, and that was after you were, I guess I'll just say it, fired in a tweet. Some of
it was kind of mutual.
Okay, all right. You should have
and
tweeted back.
just for a record, we talked about it for months.
Okay, good.
And he actually called me on the phone and said, "Hey,
Yeah.
you know, I had asked him for a date in a moment of frustration.
Yeah.
I asked him to give me a date, and then
Yeah.
he called me and said, "Hey, I'm going to tweet it." And then then of course I stayed on, right, for a smooth transition with my successor, because you know, none of these jobs are, you know, none of us are bigger than these jobs, right? I mean, it's our job to serve the country, you know, and so, you know, I was at peace with it, Jamie.
Yeah.
I mean, I was.
What the young people tell me is, if you're on board and the president fires you in a tweet, you should like the tweet. So anyway, but after that,
well, you know, I wasn't on social media. You know,
yeah,
so
I'm teasing you. So after leaving service, James Mattis called Trump a threat to the Constitution. General Kelly called Trump the most flawed person he'd ever met. You chose to remain silent, and we talked about that in the beginning of our remarks. And maybe you've answered the next question in in what you've already said, because if you see President Trump, as just a continuation in one way or another, a reflection of us over the long term, then historians looking back at this moment will say, well, General Mattis and General Kelly were undermining the principles that you articulated, the principles of service, whether you're in or whether you're out. But if that's not the case, it could be that historians may look at your decision in the context of this very divisive election with so many issues at stake. They may look critically at your decision to remain silent. How do you think historians will look at this moment, and how do you think they should look at this moment?
Well, you know, hey, first of all, you know, I respect, you know, John Kelly and Jim Mattis's, you know, decisions to do whatever the hell they want to do, you know, but you know, I as I mentioned to you, I think that we face a choice at this moment in this vitriolic partisan environment to either get drugged down into it or to try to transcend it, right? To try to appeal to those who are on both sides of the political spectrum and appeal to them based on really clear-eyed analysis of policies and actions and behavior of the president. I'll tell you, I mean, I don't know where the hell you think I've been silent, Jamie. You know, when anybody asks me the question, is it right for Donald Trump to do X? You know, and if I don't think it's right, I say, hell no, that's not right, right? But of course, I don't go far enough, you know, for some people who want me to engage in that kind of partisan vitriolic discourse that is so dominant and superficial, by the way, discourse that dominates. So, hey, you know, I'll tell you, I mean, I feel completely at peace with what I've done. I mean, I've done my duty. I've never, you know, since I've retired, shied away from any of these questions on the president's behavior or policies. But you know, I don't share, you know, the sky is falling, that our democracy is over, you know, narrative that has come to dominate our mainstream media these days. You know, when I look at the election, I mean, I was on a Sunday morning show, and the lead into the Sunday morning show made the implicit, you know, analogy between our country today and the Weimar Republic in the 1930s. And I just made the comment that, you know, that I mentioned in Battlegrounds. I say, you know, the only thing worse than the ignorance of history is the abuse of it, you know, and I mean, we're not the Weimar Republic. Record numbers of Americans voted. Okay, we're divided, you know, but if we weren't divided, we'd be a one-party system. That looks like China to me. Okay, the president's behavior, I think, has been in large measure abhorrent, you know, in recent weeks, with, you know, the allegations of conspiracy theories and allegations of widespread fraud and therefore the election not being legitimate. But you know what? Our institutions are holding up pretty damn well. But what I see is the president, but also those on the other end of the political spectrum, compromising our principles, compromising our values to score partisan political points. You know, when somebody who is an anti-Trump guy writes that maybe the military ought to have a role, you know, in the transition, then I think that's just as irresponsible as some of the president's behavior, for example. So I think we need to demand better of ourselves and demand better of our political leaders. You know, our founders were pretty brilliant about this, right? They set it up so that, hey, guess what? The executive branch doesn't even have a say in the transition. So all of this, a lot of this has just been noise, you know, and these predictions of the demise of our, you know, of our democracy, I think are, you know, are into themselves destructive. I mean, some of what you hear along these lines is much more extreme than the Russian Internet Research Agency even comes up with to undermine our confidence. So I just think hey, let's not be our own worst enemies anymore. Let's demand more from our political leaders. And so I decided to be a voice for that, right? To stop the self-destructive behavior, and I didn't want to become part of it.
Yeah, and I think that, and Claire is here recognizing to tell us that we have to open for great questions from the audience. And I think that's the balance, is how do we recreate a level of civility that we need for our democracy to function while we call good, good and bad, bad. So,
and I think learn about these issues, right? The people who are loudest and most vitriolic and who go ad hominem about these issues, they're the people typically who know the least about them, right? I mean, that's why I wrote Battlegrounds, is I hope, and right in the conclusion, I want it to spark meaningful, civil discussions, right? And about the challenges we're facing.
All right, Claire, over to you.
Our first question comes from Alvin Schoenfeld. Ambassador Schoenfeld is Grenada's ambassador to Israel, and he is asking you to weigh in on Biden's stated position of rejoining the JCPOA. And to that, I would just add that I know you're not a fan of the JCPOA, and during the Trump administration, you pursued a policy of maximum pressure against Iran. And I'm wondering if that is going to give the Biden administration leverage in renegotiating that treaty, or if things like the assassination of the nuclear scientist, Mohsen Farizadeh, has poisoned our ability to negotiate in a diplomatic way with the Iranians.
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be a huge mistake to turn the clock back to 2016, because I believe the JCPOA was a political, you know, disaster kind of masquerading as a diplomatic triumph. Now, when I was in the administration, I tried to argue to stay in, right? Because I thought, okay, we're in it now. How do we maximize the potential associated with the JCPOA by trying to strengthen the verification regime, with the prospect of us pulling out to fix some of the fundamental flaws, especially the inadequate transparency and verification, the sunset clause that really just delays Iran's efforts to get to a threshold capability and field the most destructive weapons on Earth. You know, the exclusion of missiles and other related capabilities. But most importantly, the biggest deficiency was the relaxation of sanctions and the big payoff up front. And where did that money go? It went to intensifying Iran's 40-year-long proxy war against the great Satan, us, the little Satan, Israel, and the Arab monarchies and others. And so, you know, I think that the right approach is to force the Iranian regime to make a choice. Hey, you can be treated like a responsible nation, but you have to stop the 4-decade-long proxy wars because you can't have it both ways, right? You can't reap the benefits of normal economic discourse and then apply those profits through the bunyads and through the beneficial owners of these companies in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, such that they can intensify the sectarian civil war across the region, and keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict, and place a proxy army on the border of Israel. So, I mean, I really think that, as you mentioned, that there is, Claire, an opportunity to use the maximum pressure, maybe to incentivize a new negotiation. But I'll tell you, I think if we make the same concessions that Secretary Kerry made in the process of that negotiation, that would be a huge mistake. And so I think it's also interesting to note that Iran is now threatening to restart the program that it denied ever existed, right? So, I mean, what is the basis for trusting anything they say or do? We have to remember that before the ink was dry on the agreement, the Iranians were saying, hey, here are all the places you can't look at. And so are we to have confidence that this regime is going to adhere to any international agreement, I think that's really misplaced. I described in Battlegrounds the range, the long, the history of our relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran back to 1979. And what's interesting about it is mainly an approach, a conciliatory policy that we've pursued across almost every administration actually until the Trump administration. And it hasn't paid off because we create in our minds this idea of the Iranian reformers. Hey, there was a struggle between the Republicans and the revolutionaries inside of Iran. But guess what? I mean, the Republicans lost. And so Mr. Zarif and Rouhani, they seem to be moderates and so forth, but they're the shop window. They're the shop window for the supreme leader of the Guardian Council and the IRGC. And we just have to be clear-eyed about that and make sure we don't buy back into the same assumptions that underpinned our flawed approach to Iran in other administrations.
Well, I can't let you go without some discussion around Russia, because I got the distinct impression from your book that China is really our bigger threat in the future, in the present and in the future. But most of us grew up during the Cold War. Russia, the Soviet Union, has long been our adversary. And of course, recently they've been in the news with meddling in our elections and are undermining our democratic principles. So my question is around the fact that it seems to be their chief vulnerability is the fact that their economy is dependent on extraction. And so it's tempting to fantasize that as the world starts to transition to renewables, that this is going to somehow cause Russia's economy to suffer. But energy expert Jason Bordoff, writing in Foreign Policy, throws cold water on that notion, asserting that the ease of low-cost extraction will keep Russian energy producers in business for years to come. So that being the case, what then, if any, are Russia's vulnerabilities?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the vulnerability is a stagnant economy. It's already a stagnant economy and a failing economy. They haven't been able to diversify, as you mentioned, Claire. And also, they've been hit hard by COVID and a poor response to COVID. And then also the corruption that is the lodestone around the neck of economic growth and development in Russia, and the oligarchical order atop which Putin sits at the top of kind of a protection racket where he has dirt on everybody and keeps them from killing each other, essentially. So I think it is a system that is suffering from the depression in oil prices, but also the stagnation of the economy, the corruption, and so I think that is the vulnerability. But Russia recognizes, I think, Putin recognizes the limitations, right? His economy is the size of Texas's economy or Italy's economy, and so whereas China, I think now is anxious to, in Xi Jinping's word, take center stage in the world, and you see it asserting itself and trying to create servile relationships with indebtedness and Chinese investment and the One Belt One Road, and then and thinks that it can maybe challenge the United States on our own terms now. Russia knows it can't do that head to head economically. So Russia's theory, Putin's theory of success, is to drag everybody else down and be the last man standing. So I describe Putin's strategy as disruption, disinformation, and denial. And Russian disinformation is aimed at polarizing us, pitting us against each other, and reducing our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. This is why it's heartbreaking to see Donald Trump play into their hands, and to reinforce their narrative. I think we're stronger than this, but hell, we ought to stop being our own worst enemy about it. And so I think we need to pull the curtain back on Russia's behavior. Putin employs what we might call implausible deniability. He'll poison, attempt to kill Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury. Will poison Navalny and deny it. We'll shoot down an airliner, right, where we have film of Russians doing it, and then deny that. So we have to stop letting them get away with it. I will just highlight the paradox of the Trump administration, in that the Trump administration imposed costs on Russia far beyond, orders of magnitude beyond previous administrations. And sold defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians to deter them there. But what's been sad about it is the president has not matched that, with his rhetoric and language, and in fact has created space for Putin in this implausible deniability. And you know, I don't get it. I don't understand it in Battlegrounds. I do put it in context, this tendency on the part of President Trump, in context of President Obama, also really desperately wanting a better relationship with Vladimir Putin, you know, leaning over to Medvedev when he was keeping the seat warm for Putin, saying, hey, we'll have more flexibility after the election, and trading off missile defenses in Poland for supposedly a better relationship. Secretary Clinton, of course, remember, with the reset button going to Geneva. George W. Bush administration. Also, remember when President Bush first met him, said, hey, I looked into his soul, right? Well, you know, Putin's the best liar in the world, right? And he's not going to change because he's driven. He's driven as well by this sense of honor lost at the end of the Cold War and an associated obsession with restoring Russia to national greatness. And then, cognizant of the limitations of his power, he's doing it with unscrupulousness, right? And trying to drag everybody else down.
Well, General, we're just about out of time, but I just can't go out talking about Russia. So I'm going to give you the final word tonight to our audience here in Vail, Colorado.
Hey, I think we should be optimistic about our ability to build a better future for generations to come, right? So I know some of you are probably saying, okay, you know, what kind of a Christmas gift would battle or holiday gift would Battlegrounds be? You know, read about all the depressing problems in the world. But you know, I try to end really on a positive note and recognize that, you know, that we should take a moment, I think, to be grateful for the fact that we live in a country where we do have a say in how we're governed. I write a little bit about immigration and how that's the strength of our nation, that we are a nation of immigrants in large measure, of people who come from all different places in the world, but who have faith in our system of democratic governance, of rule of law and due process of law and freedom of speech and religious tolerance and not judging people based on race or religion or sexual orientation, right? We are a country that is virtuous. We are a country that has been and always will be imperfect. Our founders recognized that our republic required constant nurturing, but we can do this, right? And we can emerge from these quadruple crises, you know, of a pandemic, the recession associated with it, there's social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the aftermath, and the related concerns of inequality of opportunity and unequal treatment under the law. And now, of course, this vitriolic political season that we're still stuck in, you know, until January 20th, I guess, at least. So, or at least December 14th, right, when the electors vote. So, hey, I think we can get beyond this. I mean, I do believe that the American people are less polarized than we see the extremes, you know, in our society, and the political elites and the media as well. So anyway, I'm hopeful. I really appreciate, Claire, the opportunity to be with you. Thanks to you and Jamie for the great conversation. And you know, going into the holiday season, we should all maybe get, you know, a dose of optimism, you know, and when people are, you know, give us the gloom and doom message, look at the facts, right? And so thanks again.
General McMaster, thank you so much for your expertise and time tonight. Jamie Metzl, thank you always for your generous support for the Vail Symposium. General, also, I would like to say thank you so much for your service. For everyone watching tonight, thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us next week on December 15th when we take a look at climate change and national security. Good night, everyone.